I'm Barbara Lucas, and welcome to the Green Room, where we explore the environmental topics that green up our world. We're here today with Gary Crawford, an aquatic biologist, and we'll be discussing threats to our wetlands, most notably the large invasive grass called Phragmites australis, or common reed. Welcome to the show, Gary.
Good. It's good to be here.
So back in 2007, your firm was hired to control, through chemicals, the Phragmites on Beaver Island, which is in northern Lake Michigan off of Charlevoix.
Yes.
What was unique about that situation?
That situation was unique, and it had some characteristics that allowed us to be very successful. One of the things was that it was in small, discrete patches, so they caught it early, and they had a tremendous amount of community involvement in that situation that even helped us further to identify certain locations where it was already existing.
For instance, they had, I know because we have a house up there, and they had articles in the two local papers, they
Yes.
had community meetings, they had newsletters through the Property Owners Association, and also they had a movie made on Phragmites, what it is and how to control it.
Yeah.
So we're going to show that movie now.
I've never seen a species to grow so fast and proliferate so fast.
It's taken such a strong foothold so quickly in our coastal wetlands here in the Great Lakes that by the time we're getting around to trying to control it, it's become these monotypic stands that are extremely hard to eradicate.
The invasive strain of Phragmites australis, or common reed, is a tall European grass that is spreading rapidly into our native ecosystems. This is one threat we can't afford to ignore.
3 years ago, you could stand out and look over this vista, and you could see the lake out there. As I stand here now, some of this stuff is well over 8 feet, 10 feet tall. The root system is vast. You can't even pull it out, it's in there so tight. It takes up the vistas of the lakes. It can affect our tourism. This is a huge problem. It's a statewide problem that needs to be addressed.
It's extremely difficult to walk through. The broken off ends of the shoots are very sharp.
That's when I was trying to pull the Phragmites out.
If you have a solid Phragmites beach, it won't be a beach anymore.
It's important to control the Phragmites because you're in fact taking pieces out of the pie and not replacing it with anything good.
The Phragmites is of absolutely no nutritional value to wildlife. Birds don't eat the seeds of Phragmites. It grows in such extremely high stem densities that it's essentially becomes impenetrable, and wildlife just can't even use it as cover.
Phragmites is a tremendous dominator of ecosystems.
In contrast, native coastal and wetland ecosystems support hundreds of different species.
All of the plants and all of the animals that rely on those plants are part of Michigan's and the Great Lakes region's natural heritage, and we should be concerned about losing that heritage.
The Saginaw Bay area is an example of what can happen. Previously a hugely important migratory bird habitat and fish spawning area, the bay was prized by outdoor enthusiasts.
The existing coastal wetlands associated with Saginaw Bay now have become monotypic stands of Phragmites. That's hurting our wildlife populations, our fish populations. It's impacting our ability to recreate in those wetlands, and it's having economic impacts as well locally.
Even remote islands are not outside its reach. On the Beaver Archipelago in northern Lake Michigan, the recently arrived Phragmites is threatening the precious habitat of such endangered species as piping plover, Michigan monkey flower, and pitcher's thistle. But there is hope. When treatment begins quickly, Phragmites can be managed in places where it's just beginning to take hold. Islanders are mobilizing against this threat to their property values and recreational resources. Invasive Phragmites. What does it look like? Control efforts start with proper identification.
Phragmites is a giant grass reaching sometimes 15 feet high. Broad leaves, sometimes as much as an inch broad, and developing a big silvery plume. The winter stems persist as thin canes reminiscent of a slender bamboo. The first few years it's small, and then it builds up in size. At the edge of a stand, you can also sometimes see the phenomenal runners that it has, which can creep across the ground sometimes 60 or 80 feet in one season, which are well named because that's what it allows it to run at a tremendous rate to cover beaches and sand flats.
Although a smaller Phragmites is native to North America, only the tall European strain proliferates rapidly and threatens native ecosystems.
Now these Phragmites on Barney's Lake are the native ones, and you can see even from here the tall stems from last year don't have any leaves. Now we're at Little Sand Bay. This is the invasive version of the Phragmites, but if you look at it closely, these are last year's leaves right here. And that native one that we had at Barney's Lake didn't have any of these on it at all.
How does it invade new territory? Phragmites spreads mostly by rooting versus seeding.
Even a small piece will sprout and after a few years produce a large colony. And movement along streams and lake shores is by movement of pieces by water.
Phragmites is accidentally introduced by boats carrying mud and plant fragments, along highways by earth-moving equipment, and by new construction which creates the disturbance perfect for Phragmites infestations. Phragmites has also been intentionally introduced for wildlife cover, for erosion control along highways and stream banks, and to remove water from sewage sludge. Phragmites along roadways may seem harmless, but its arrival in valuable coastal and wetland areas is a huge problem for wildlife and for people. Communities that plan and execute control measures now can prevent overwhelming difficulties in the future. Here are 10 basic guidelines for Phragmites control.
We can do it as a community. We can plan it out and get kids involved, get other people involved in helping find the areas, map them, and target removing these species.
Once you know the extent of the problem, weigh your options. Chemical treatment may be the only effective solution, but until that can begin, containing the spread is essential. Sometimes small infestations can be dug up with a pitchfork, but every bit of the root system must be removed or it will continue to spread. Unfortunately, the roots are usually too firmly entrenched to dig up. Cutting off seed heads can also be futile.
Cutting off the seed heads just simply isn't going to be functional. That particular patch is going to spread vegetatively. It'll be essentially a waste of time.
A better way to temporarily contain it is by cutting off the spreading runners.
Because every place it goes down in the sand, it sends out roots like this and then a new plant grows. So this is what we need to get up.
It is essential to dispose of all parts of the plant immediately to prevent further spread. Composting will not kill it. Small amounts can be double bagged, tied securely, and then added to the household trash.
When you break the plant up into small pieces, you increase the chances that you can spread fragments.
Rototilling just sends your problem elsewhere. Be a good neighbor. Don't groom your beach. In most cases, application of herbicides is the only way to kill Phragmites. A permit may be required. Apply for the permit early. Sometimes adjacent properties can share a permit. Coordinate with your neighbors.
We just have to be very careful that we have a plan and don't do it piecemeal because these chemicals can be very, very dangerous.
Wetlands are special in that there are only certain chemicals that are approved. So the Roundup formulation that you buy on hardware store and garden center shelves is not approved for applying to wetlands.
Apply the herbicides only in late summer or early fall before the leaves turn brown. During this time, nutrients are moving down to the roots to prepare for winter. Chemicals applied before this period of downward flow will not kill the plant.
Do-it-yourselfers are an American tradition, but in this case, it's probably a good idea to let a professional do it.
Choose only certified herbicide application technicians who are up to date on Phragmites identification and control. Proper chemical treatment requires knowledge of the right plant, the right herbicide, the right dose, the right methods, and the right time of year. Make sure you are well informed. The potential for recurrence is high. Treatments will likely need to be repeated for several years.
It can take years to get the Phragmites knocked back to a condition where a lot of native plants can start to regerminate in these wetlands.
Ongoing monitoring is an essential part of the plan. And dead thatch should be removed to allow native species to gain a foothold. It's a big job, but communities that are proactive can be successful.
If you can get it when it's still at the beginning, that's the secret.
Controlling it early is easier always than controlling it later.
This is something that has to be addressed, and addressed immediately
Well, let me show you.
in the Great Lakes area and at our home.
It's not only for us, but it's for the next generation.
Gary, the movie covers a lot of territory really fast, and I'd like to revisit some of it. For instance, the section on the spread of Phragmites through North America. Can you describe that?
Well, first thing, what we should know is that Phragmites is one of the most common plants in the whole world. It's called
Really?
the common reed. It's found in Egypt and Europe.
Wow.
But it came over, I believe, with the settlers who were initially going to inhabit the United States. And there's also some native forms that were already here. But the European form, which is now what we call the invasive or non-native form, had started on the East Coast, and it has progressively moved all the way to southeast United States, some areas in the Mississippi Basin, and across up to Canada, and also to the West Coast.
Wow, all over.
All over.
And in terms of locally, what's been your experience? When did you first start noticing it here?
Well, my first experience is as a little kid. I was going fishing with my father, and we were going down to an area, kind of a bayou on Lake Erie, and I remember walking through some very, very tall plants. I mean, this was a place where, you know, as a little kid, it was pretty exciting, but these plants were huge. And I remember kind of following my father through a path there, and it wasn't until as I started to, you know, operate my own business that I was called in to do some of the first experiments on Phragmites, and at that initial identification, I knew that that's what I had seen back in the late 70s, early 80s. So.
I didn't realize it was here back then.
Yes, it was.
And I've heard, strangely enough, that in Europe, where it's native, they're concerned about it decreasing, actually. And that just seems so ironic that it could be increasing exponentially here and decreasing in Europe, where it's native. Now, why would that be?
Well, in Europe, it's seen as a resource because of the thatch roof industry. And so that's, common reed is used for that. But its demise is because you have other plants that are able to maybe withstand its spread. You also have a lot of herbivores, at least over 170 different types of insects and animals who feed on Phragmites in its native habitat.
Now, why don't they just bring some of those predators over here and let them eat it up in North America?
Well, you know what? Biological controls, like in the case of the purple loose strife, can be successful. But at other times, it can be, you have to be very careful with it, and there's a lot of testing that's involved. So that is kind of ongoing and underway.
But they haven't come up with anything yet?
No, not yet.
And I guess they have to be pretty careful. I do remember the Asian ladybugs, releasing those in the 80s, thousands of them, and now they've come back to haunt us. They're increasing exponentially and becoming pests in our houses. And
most definitely. And that's what biological controls, you know, over time, they may change, they may have some changes in their genetics or their behavior that causes them, you know, no longer to be the nice, tidy control organisms that we had originally intended.
One thing that people have been talking about is that the native Phragmites is benign. It doesn't push out other organisms, and it is good for our wetlands.
Yes.
But it seems to be spreading aggressively in some areas, and people are wondering if it could be cross-hybridizing with the invasive Phragmites. Is that possible?
That's entirely possible, because plants are kind of notorious for hybridizing. I mean, that's how we get various types of apples, and as well as other types of flowers that we like. It's just a sharing of chromosomes and genetic material that can happen by having the same parental crosses, and that's something that occurs.
Kind of scary.
Yeah, it is.
Another question that people have been discussing is the question of seed viability, whether or not those seeds can actually sprout. And in our video, our botanist mentioned that it's the root system that we really need to worry about, and that the seed heads really aren't where the reproduction occurs mostly. But recently I read some research results saying that the seed heads were found to be viable under the perfect conditions. So should we start worrying about those seeds?
I think it's a concern, because there's been, in many instances, there's been mixed information or mixed results, and some of that deals with the method or what they're really trying to look at. But I believe that a plant like Phragmites, who gives so much seed, probably has a certain amount of that seed that's viable, and under the right conditions, I don't doubt that it would spread. If you look at the pattern of spread throughout the country, you'd have to assume some of it is by seed.
And I guess it only takes one or two from a seed head to reproduce the plant 100%. So chemicals, that is a very interesting subject, because when I was first learning about environmentalism, I always equated it with anti-chemicals. But now with Phragmites, you find some of the most respected botanists and biologists and environmental advocates, advocating chemicals for Phragmites. So what is the reason for that?
Well, there's a couple reasons for chemicals, and one of those reasons is that the chemicals that they use are systemic and kind of specific for plant and plant uptake. It affects processes in plants specifically. Some of the additional things that you might use in a chemical, there's some concern about those. However, much like in cancer, when you have something that is growing uncontrollably, you want to use the thing that's most effective to get it, under control.
So chemotherapy has its downsides, but it's the lesser of evils. And in this
Yes.
case, chemicals are the lesser of evils.
Yes, and in some cases, even there's other methods that also work, but for large infestations, and I'm talking about acres upon acres, chemicals seem to be the way to go.
Yeah, I have been hearing about some people using non-chemical methods like spreading cloth or plastic to smother the plants, or repeatedly cutting like 4 times a season to weaken the root system.
Yes.
What are the pros and cons of those techniques?
Well, the pros and cons is that, first of all, we're not introducing chemicals into our environment. That's one of the pros. Another thing is that it's also a situation where if you are not a trained or licensed herbicide applicator, you can actually have some input and have some control that you can use yourself. One of the cons is that it can be very labor intensive for certain areas that are much larger. So if you can imagine cutting, a couple acres of Phragmites 4 times a year with all the biomass that it can contribute, that's a pretty significant effort.
Yeah, and one of my concerns is the botanist in the video mentioned that it spreads by fragments, going down the shoreline to the neighbor's house or whatever. They're talking about don't groom your beaches because that just spreads fragments elsewhere. So it would seem that if you were cutting it repeatedly, you're just almost seeding the entire shoreline.
Yes.
I don't know, maybe you're reducing it at your spot, but I'd like to see research into, whether it spreads it or not.
I think there needs to be further study in that aspect. You can see that occur in instances where you cut some of the long runners and things like that, and they can continue to sprout up away from its original what I would say clone. So you do see some things like that with fragmentation, and if you are controlling Phragmites mechanically, it's best to put it in a black bag and then dispose of it properly.
Hand swiping is something that the video didn't go into, and I know you did that up at Beaver Island in certain areas. Which areas did you use it, and why?
There were some sensitive areas that were part of a conservancy out of Traverse City, and they had those areas under conservatorship because they were highly prized. They had threatened and endangered plant species there. It was really unique communities, but Phragmites was there as well. So we didn't want to risk hurting the plants below it. And the stands happened to be at a density where there were other plants that were existing. Once you get a thick stand, it's really hard to not want to use something like a chemical. But we wanted to preserve the understory, so we hand swiped about an acre.
So you dip your hands, first you put on some kind of cloth gloves, and then you dip your hands in the herbicide and then go through each one. So it's very tedious, I bet, but at least you're not spraying it and you're controlling specifically.
Well, that's the whole key, is that you're trying to minimize impact from the results of that you may have with spraying. I mean, there's droplets that are going to occur. You can't be 100% effective on your target, and that's one of the ways to kind of minimize that.
And I would think it'd be safer for the applicator as well, because you're not breathing in the spray.
Yeah, I think, you know, as long as your latex glove underneath your cotton glove holds up, you're not getting you're not getting exposure.
It seems like there are so many different ways to deal with this, and nobody's really sure what's the best way. And I get the feeling that it's because the science is so new that everybody's kind of struggling trying to figure out what works best, and that maybe if we can share experiences more, so that because all over North America people are working on this stuff, and towards that end I've heard that the state of Michigan and the Great Lakes Commission are sponsoring a symposium at the end of March in Lansing. At the end of this show we'll give details on how to find out how you can attend that symposium. And also there's a listserv that the Great Lakes Commission has sponsored that's for people, anyone that's interested in sharing information about Phragmites. And again, at the end of the show we'll have details on how to sign up for that listserv. But I just want to play devil's advocate for a second and ask, what would happen if we were to just let it go? Because some people say, it's myself included, that it's kind of pretty, and along the roadside you're driving along and think, well, it's kind of nice to see that stuff swaying in the wind. I mean, what would happen if 20 years from now we just let it go?
Well, what would happen is that Phragmites would probably take over, and we'd have a system of wetland habitats that would largely be, you know, composed of one plant species. And that means that all of the other organisms, the insects, the frogs, the birds that utilize the seeds and the habitat from these other native plants, they'd have no place to go because all they'd have is Phragmites, and they've shown that Phragmites has a lower amount of diversity of other organisms when it's dominant.
Well, and I've also heard that it can be a safety issue, right? You were telling me about a fatal accident. And
most definitely. In St. Clair County, they have some severe issues with Phragmites in a lot of the roadside ditches and places like that that run along the streets there. And because it was a visual hazard, it had grown up. People had to go out so much into the street in order to kind of see the traffic. Well, in one case, somebody kind of went out too far, and it was a bad situation.
And I worry about that stuff getting caught in the wheels and the cutting mechanisms of the mowers, and then spreading it farther down the freeway. I mean, it just makes sense why it's spreading so fast on our freeways.
Absolutely.
So it seems like the main goal, no matter what technique is used, is to have early detection, rapid response. And do you want to address that, why that's so crucial?
It's crucial because if you're going to deal with something that can grow and expand so quickly, you're going to have less time, less effort, and less cost in dealing with it if you can detect it early. you minimize the risk of it spreading, you minimize the risk of it becoming a problem in other locations, and you minimize the amount of effort it's going to take to control it. I think with invasive species, the entire key as we deal with this issue is being able to educate people to know what it is, to be able to make an identification, and then know how to address it.
But even prevention costs something. I
Yes,
mean,
it does.
even though we all know it's cheaper, nipping in the bud, it still costs something. What's funding looking like these days?
Well, you know what? Most of the funding is usually targeted to deal with it after it's been well established, or to deal with it if it's a problem in a sensitive area. There's some issues with changing of congressional leadership and things like that. Funding can always be in jeopardy if this is not considered a high priority. So if it's important to the state of Michigan and important to the tourism industry, then we need to be involved in kind of letting people know that.
Well, big, important topic. I wish we had more time to talk about it, but unfortunately we're out of time. If you'd like to view this show online, go to ewashna.org/greenroom. There you will also find a link to the symposium that we mentioned on invasive Phragmites that will be held March 29th and 30th in Lansing, and also information about how to join the listserv that we mentioned for people sharing information about Phragmites that is hosted by the Great Lakes Commission. Thanks for joining us here in the Green Room.